Jake spent 3 years building a fortress in the desert to keep the past away. It didn't work. When his son Leo finally returns, he doesn't come home with a diploma. He comes in a car riddled with bullet holes. He holds the key to Project Kronos, a nuclear secret buried for 50 years. Now, the most dangerous army in the world is on their doorstep. The quiet life is dead. The war is back. The New Mexico sun hammered down on the White Sands Desert, bleaching the world into blinding shades of white and beige. In the middle of this nothingness sat a structure that looked less like a home and more like a bunker. It was constructed from reinforced shipping containers, welded together and partially buried against the heat and the wind. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone. Jake sat in front of a bank of monitors, his eyes scanning the perimeter feeds with an obsessive intensity. He was 47 now, and the years had been unkind. His hair was gray, cut short, and he walked with a noticeable limp, a permanent reminder of the injuries from Texas 3 years ago. He wasn't drinking. That was a weakness he could not afford. Instead, he was fueled by adrenaline and paranoia. On a heated orthopedic mat in the corner lay Wolf. The German Shepherd was 10 years old. His muzzle was entirely white, and his once powerful legs were stiff with arthritis. He slept heavily, letting out a soft snore, but Jake knew that even in sleep, the dog's ears were tuning into the vibrations of the desert. A cloud of dust appeared on monitor 3. Jake leaned forward. A vehicle was tearing across the salt flats, moving erratically. As it drew closer, the high-definition camera revealed the jagged holes punched into the chassis. Bullet holes. Jake stood up, grabbing the tactical rifle, leaning against the desk. He limped to the heavy steel door and threw it open just as the battered sedan skidded to a halt in the gravel. The driver's door kicked open. A young man stumbled out. It was Leo. At 20, he was tall and broad-shouldered, but his face was pale with shock. "Dad!" Leo shouted, his voice cracking. Jake lowered the rifle, his heart skipping a beat. "Leo?" Leo didn't hug him. He rushed forward, shoving a dirty, heavy plastic keycard into Jake's hand. It looked like Cold War-era tech, thick and magnetic. "They found it," Leo gasped, looking back at the horizon. "Project Kronos is real. The Legion is right behind me." As if summoned by the name, a low, buzzing sound filled the air. It wasn't the sound of a car engine, but the angry hum of high-speed rotors. "Drones," Jake said, looking up. 4 black shapes crested the dunes, armed and moving fast. "Get Wolf," Jake ordered, his voice calm and commanding. "Get him in the truck, now!" Leo ran inside. Jake didn't raise his rifle. He knew bullets were useless against that many targets. Instead, he walked to a small, nondescript breaker box mounted on the exterior wall. He waited. The drones dove, their weapon systems locking on. "Come on," Jake whispered. When the lead drone was 50 yards out, Jake threw the heavy switch. Buried beneath the sand in a wide radius around the compound, a ring of homemade electromagnetic pulse emitters surged to life. There was a sharp cracking sound of electrical discharge. The air distorted for a split second. The drones dropped from the sky like stones, their circuits fried instantly, crashing harmlessly into the sand. Leo emerged from the container, carrying the 70-pound dog in his arms because Wolf couldn't move fast enough. He gently placed the old dog into the back seat of Jake's modified armored Jeep. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the ground team gets here," Jake said, climbing into the driver's seat. He looked at his son, then at the old dog panting in the back. "Hold on." Jake slammed the vehicle into gear, leaving his fortress behind as they sped toward the deeper desert. The modified Jeep tore across the dunes of White Sands, its suspension groaning under the strain of the erratic terrain. Jake gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. He drove with the muscle memory of a younger man, drifting the heavy vehicle around the base of a massive gypsum dune to break their line of sight. In the rearview mirror, a column of dust signaled the approach of the pursuers. Voss, the cold strategist leading the Legion's ground team, sat in the passenger seat of a sleek, military-grade armored transport. He watched the fleeing Jeep through high-powered digital binoculars. He did not look angry. He looked like a man solving a calculus equation. He tapped his headset, ordering his drivers to flank the target. Inside Jake's Jeep, the ride was brutal. In the back seat, Wolf let out a sharp whine as the vehicle slammed over a ridge. The 10-year-old German Shepherd was trying to brace himself, but his arthritic hips could not absorb the shocks. He panted heavily, his tongue lolling, his eyes wide with confusion and discomfort. He was no longer the warrior who could leap from moving trucks. He was a tired old soldier who just wanted to rest. "I cannot shake them," Jake shouted over the roar of the engine. "They are faster and they have better suspension." Leo was not looking out the window. He was hunched over his laptop, his body swaying with the motion of the car. He had connected the computer to a heavy, military-grade signal booster he had jerry-rigged to the dashboard. "Keep driving, Dad," Leo said, his voice tight with concentration. "Just keep them behind us for 30 more seconds." "What are you doing?" Jake asked, swerving to avoid a cluster of rocks. "I am talking to a ghost," Leo replied. Leo's fingers flew across the keys. He was pinging an old, decommissioned military satellite that drifted in a decaying orbit above them. It was a relic of the same era as Project Kronos, forgotten by modern networks, but still listening for a command code. Leo had that code. On Voss's dashboard, the GPS display suddenly flickered. A high-priority alert flashed on his screen, overriding his local sensors. It indicated a massive thermal signature, a potential minefield activation directly in their path, while falsely showing Jake's vehicle veering sharply to the east. Voss frowned. He signaled his driver. "Hard right, intercept them at the eastern ridge, avoid the hazard zone." Behind Jake, the entire column of armored vehicles suddenly swerved in unison, peeling away from the Jeep and tearing off toward a section of the desert marked with faded skull and crossbone signs. Leo slammed the laptop shut. They took the bait. Jake watched in the mirror as the enemy disappeared behind a wall of dust, heading straight for a dummy minefield that Leo had tricked their sensors into registering as active. The Jeep slowed. Jake reached back, placing a trembling hand on Wolf's head. The old dog leaned into the touch, letting out a long, weary breath. "That was not luck," Jake said, looking at his son with a newfound respect. "No," Leo said, wiping dust from his glasses. "That was math." The coordinates Leo had extracted from the satellite feed led them away from the dunes and toward the rocky foothills of the San Andres Mountains. Tucked into a canyon, hidden from the main highway, stood a dilapidated structure that looked like a forgotten radar relay station from the 1950s. The corrugated metal walls were rusted through, and the chain-link fence was buried under decades of drift sand. Jake parked the Jeep in the shadow of the building. He helped Wolf out of the back seat. The old dog moved stiffly, his joints protesting the long ride, but his nose immediately began working the stale air. Leo walked to a heavy steel door secured by an electronic lock that looked surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the facility. He pulled the dirty plastic keycard from his pocket and swiped it. A heavy solenoid clanked deep within the door, and it groaned open. Inside, it was not a room, but a freight elevator large enough to hold a tank. "We are going down," Leo said, his voice echoing in the metal box. The descent was slow and loud. For a full minute, the only sound was the grinding of gears and the hum of ventilation fans pulling air from deep underground. When the cage finally settled with a heavy thud, the far doors hissed open. Jake raised his flashlight, but he didn't need it. Emergency floodlights flickered to life, illuminating a space so vast it took his breath away. They were standing on the platform of a subterranean railway station, carved directly into the bedrock. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and ancient grease. Stretching out into the darkness was a train unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was a black armored Leviathan, 20 cars long, sitting silent and imposing on the tracks. The metal skin was thick, designed to withstand a blast, and there were no windows. "The Iron Serpent," Jake whispered. He had heard rumors of the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison Project, mobile nuclear launch platforms designed to hide in the rail network, but seeing it was a different matter. This was a tomb for the end of the world. They stepped off the elevator platform. Leo started walking briskly toward the locomotive, eager to connect to the onboard systems. "Wait," Jake said, his instincts flaring. Wolf, who had been limping beside Jake, suddenly stopped. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and the fur along his spine rose. He let out a sharp warning bark and stepped in front of Jake, blocking his path with his body. Leo stopped and looked back. "What is it?" Wolf was staring at the empty air between them and the train. He tilted his head, listening to a sound that human ears could not register. It was the high-frequency whine of a high-voltage capacitor charging. "Don't move," Jake commanded Leo. Wolf barked again, snapping his jaws at the empty space. Leo pulled out his tablet and switched the camera to the infrared spectrum. He gasped. Directly in front of them, invisible to the naked eye, was a grid of thermal laser sensors and electrified tripwires. One more step would have triggered a lethal defensive countermeasure. "The perimeter is still active," Leo said, his face pale. Wolf heard the electricity. Jake reached down and scratched the old dog behind the ears. Wolf leaned into the touch, his job done, though his legs trembled with the effort of standing guard. Leo disabled the thermal sensors with a few keystrokes, clearing a narrow path through the invisible grid. They hurried across the concrete platform, the air cold and heavy with the smell of ozone. They climbed the steel ladder into the lead locomotive of the Iron Serpent. The interior of the train was a claustrophobic time capsule from the 1980s. There were no touchscreens or holographic displays here. Instead, the command center was a wall of curved CRT monitors, heavy mechanical switches, and rows of blinking analog lights. It was technology built for durability, not aesthetics, designed to survive the end of the world. Jake secured the heavy blast door behind them, spinning the locking wheel until it sealed with a dull, metallic thud. He leaned against it, catching his breath. His leg throbbed with a deep, aching pain, and he rubbed his thigh absent-mindedly. Wolf did not patrol the room. The 10-year-old German Shepherd limped to a spot near the ventilation grate and collapsed with a heavy sigh. His breathing was raspy, and his cloudy eyes watched Jake with a weary devotion. The dog was running on pure will, his body failing even as his spirit remained unbroken. Leo sat at the main terminal, sweeping dust off a console. He pulled a cable from his backpack and connected his modern laptop to a port that looked like it hadn't been used in 40 years. "It is an isolated network," Leo said, his fingers flying across the keys. "I am bridging the gap." The ancient screens flickered. Lines of green code began to scroll rapidly down the monitors. A low hum started beneath their feet as the dormant systems of Project Kronos began to cycle up. "I am in," Leo whispered. "I am waking it up." Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed from outside, vibrating through the thick armor of the train. The blast doors at the far end of the underground station had been breached. Jake moved to the small, reinforced slit that served as a window. Far down the platform, beams of tactical light cut through the darkness. Voss and his soldiers had arrived. Jake raised his rifle, aiming it at the door they had just locked. He waited for the inevitable assault, for the sound of cutting torches or explosives. But the attack did not come. Instead, a burst of static crackled from the dusty speakers mounted in the ceiling of the train car. "Do not bother locking the door, Jake," a voice said. It was smooth, cold, and amplified. It was Voss. Jake looked at the speaker, his jaw tightening. "We have secured the elevator and the ventilation shafts," Voss continued. "You are sealed in a metal box buried 300 feet underground. There is nowhere to run." Leo stopped typing, looking at his father with wide eyes. "Boy," Voss's voice shifted, addressing Leo directly. "I know you can hear me. You're smart, you know the odds. Open the system. Give me the source code." Jake looked at Wolf. The old dog had lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat at the sound of the disembodied voice. "Your father is a relic, Leo," Voss said, his tone dropping to a mockingly sympathetic register. "Look at him. He is broken. He is old. He cannot protect you forever. End this now and you walk away." Jake did not speak. He simply checked the safety on his rifle and stood his ground between his son and the door. The command car of the Iron Serpent hummed with the awakening of a digital god. The banks of curved glass monitors flickered from static gray to a sharp, piercing green. Leo, now 20 years old, stood before the main console, his hands moving rapidly over the mechanical keyboard. The air in the enclosed space was stale and cold, smelling of old copper and imminent danger. Jake stood guard by the reinforced door, his weapon raised. At 47, his body was a map of old injuries, and the cold dampness of the underground tunnel was making his bad leg ache with a deep, throbbing rhythm. Beside him lay Wolf. The 10-year-old German Shepherd was exhausted. His muzzle was white with age, and his breathing was heavy, but his eyes remained fixed on the door, ready to defend his pack to his last breath. Suddenly, the monitors coalesced into a single, terrifying image. It was a map of the world, overlaid with complex webs of financial data and military logistics. "It is running a simulation," Leo whispered, his face illuminated by the eerie green glow. On the screen, red lines began to spread like a virus across the continents. Stock markets crashed in microseconds. Governments toppled. Supply chains dissolved. It was a blueprint for global chaos, calculated with cold, mathematical precision. From the speakers overhead, the voice of Voss returned. It was calm, reasonable, and terrifying. "Do you see it, Leo?" Voss asked. "It is not destruction. It is a reset. The world is broken. Kronos can fix it. I can fix it. Just give me the administrative control." Jake looked at the screen. He saw famine. He saw war. He saw the end of the world Leo was supposed to inherit. Leo ignored the voice. He typed a query into the command line. "Is there a kill switch?" The AI responded instantly. "System purge requires manual disconnect of the primary fuel rods. Warning, core chamber radiation levels will be lethal within 30 seconds of breach." The words hung in the air. Lethal? Leo froze. He stared at the flashing warning. "We cannot stop it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We cannot get into the engine room without dying." Jake stepped away from the door. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and walked over to his son. He looked at the warning on the screen, then at the heavy airlock door labeled Engine Maintenance. "We can stop it," Jake said softly. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. The boy looked up, and the realization hit him. He saw the resolve in his father's weathered face, the peace in his eyes. "No," Leo said, shaking his head. "No, Dad." "It is the only way," Jake said. He looked down at Wolf. The old dog thumped his tail once, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jake knelt and kissed the dog's head. Then he stood and faced his son. "My job has always been to keep you safe," Jake said. "This is my final mission. You take Wolf. You get to the cargo elevator. You live." Jake turned toward the airlock. He reached for the heavy steel wheel that would seal his fate, intending to enter the radiation zone alone to save the future. The hum of the cooling systems grew louder, a rising mechanical shriek that warned of critical instability. Jake, the 47-year-old veteran, placed his hand on the manual override lever. His weathered face was set in grim determination. He looked at his son, Leo. "Go," Jake said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Take Wolf and get to the freight elevator. I will detonate the core manually. It is the only way to stop Voss." Leo did not move. The 20-year-old stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the main console. He was no longer the frightened child Jake remembered. He was a man with a plan. "No one has to die today, Dad," Leo said calmly. "You use muscle, I use my head." Leo's fingers flew across the ancient keyboard. He was not inputting a self-destruct code. He was overriding the safety protocols for the engine. On the screen, a command flashed. "Emergency Evacuation Protocol Alpha." Suddenly, the floor beneath them lurched violently. The iron serpent, dormant for decades, roared to life with a deafening grind of metal on metal. Outside the blast doors, Voss and his mercenaries were preparing their breach charges. They scrambled back in confusion as the massive armored train surged forward. The train did not stop. It plowed through the barricades Voss had set up, scattering his equipment and leaving his team choking in a massive cloud of dust and diesel fumes. They were not killed, but they were left behind, stranded in the dark with no prize. Inside the command car, the acceleration pinned Jake and Leo against their seats. Wolf, the 10-year-old German Shepherd, slid across the floor until Jake grabbed his harness. The old dog let out a low whine, his white muzzled face pressed against Jake's knee. "We are running out of track," Jake shouted over the roar of the engine. "I know," Leo replied, his eyes glued to the GPS data. "There is an old flood discharge vent 3 miles ahead. It opens into the canyon." The train sped through the dark tunnel, a bullet of steel racing toward the light. Ahead, the tunnel ended abruptly, opening into the vast, blinding brightness of the New Mexico desert. The rails simply stopped at the edge of a sheer cliff. The iron serpent shot out of the mountain, hanging in the air for a heart-stopping second before gravity took hold. "Now!" Leo yelled, hitting a large red button on the console. Explosive bolts fired with a sharp crack. The command module, designed as a detachable escape pod for high-ranking officers, separated from the main body of the train. As the 20 cars of the nuclear train plummeted down into the deep canyon below, crashing with a thunderous impact that shook the earth. The command pod deployed emergency parachutes and thrusters. It skidded to a rough, grinding halt on the sandy plateau, safe from the wreckage below. Silence returned to the desert. Jake kicked open the jammed door of the pod. He stumbled out, his legs shaking, and pulled Wolf after him. Leo followed, coughing in the dust. They walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down. Far below, the remains of Project Kronos lay broken and smoking. The secret was buried forever. Jake sat down heavily in the sand, the adrenaline fading to leave only exhaustion. He looked at his hands, then at his son. He realized in that moment that Leo had not just saved them. He had outsmarted a warlord and neutralized a global threat without firing a single shot. Wolf limped over to Jake and licked the soot from his face, his tail wagging slowly. "You did good," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to their battered Jeep, which they had left hidden nearby. He also unclasped his old military watch, a symbol of his time as the protector. He handed them both to Leo. "What is this?" Leo asked. "It is your turn," Jake said, smiling for the first time in years. "You drive." Leo took the keys, looking at the horizon where the sun was setting over the white sands. They were no longer running. They were going home. We often think protecting someone means shielding them from the world, but true love is trusting them to face it on their own terms. Jake realized that the greatest legacy he could leave Leo was not safety, but belief. If this moment of passing the torch resonated with you, please consider liking this video and sharing your feelings in the comments. Your support keeps this family's journey alive. We invite you to subscribe and follow their new path together. The next chapter is ready for you to watch right now.